discussing rational choice theory and the question of how do we actually choose what to do. I want to dissect this episode into several segments. One is talk about rational choice theory as much as I understand, which is founded in microeconomics, my training as an economist, where I was trained in microeconomics. So the decision making of rational agents, and I want to transition into the more modern view of decision making as far as humans is concerned, which adds the biases rooted in Tversky, Kahneman, which I'm not a big fan of, by the way, and I'm going to discuss why. And then third, I want to kind of conclude where I stand and where we at Orange Capital Partners feel the rubber meets the road, which is the question of iteration and choice of what to iterate is really what matters. In other words, there's no such thing as the right or wrong choice when it comes to absolutes, but there is the right or wrong choice when it comes to, okay, which conjecture am I gonna dare to implement now, or which project am I gonna start, knowing that I might be wrong, I might fail. Nevertheless, in the aggregate, the iteration is really what compounds my return in any kind of context, meaning not just financial, but this applies to life, this applies to education, anything where you add energy or wealth to a system. It requires iteration, requires try and error, requires making choices about what to iterate about next. And to us, this is the real question. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's November 20th, 2022 in Delco. It's a Sunday. There's no update. For the year, we're down 57%. The market is down 14.8%. We're underperforming by 42.2%. Our massive underperformance in the last couple of weeks is driven by Twitter, actually. In other words, Elon Musk buying Twitter and putting pressure on Tesla as the only proxy that you can use now to kind of get out of or short Twitter or short that situation or express unhappiness or whatever you want to use. I don't want to spend too much time right now on this because, again, the episode is about something completely different. But our podcast is about how it feels like running a hedge fund. We're running a hedge fund and we're in the thick of it, down 57%. It's almost embarrassing to say that number, but it's the truth and it's part of the business. Some might ask, why are you still in business? Well, our returns since inception are still in the double digits. We've done extremely well, but we've failed this year. We've failed this year for three reasons. Number one, we held on to Tesla because we saw that the fundamentals are sound, and we thought that owning a stock that has sound fundamentals should save us through the tough times that we saw coming ahead in terms of inflation, in terms of people not wanting to work, in terms of productivity coming down. So a lot of things where we saw the writings on the wall, but we also saw the strong fundamentals of Tesla. So that was the first mistake. I think the second mistake we made is we could have hung on to Tesla, but hedged our position by either shorting the market or buying puts on Tesla. And I would say that's just a mistake that we made. We could have invested 10% of our portfolio for insurance and still done a lot better than what we've performed so far this year. And I think this is the number one lesson that I'd like people to take away here. It's sometimes worth buying insurance. It is worth it. It is not a waste of capital. And we should have done that. We should have done that. So this is a mistake. After a stellar performance that we had, we were almost in the 20% CAGR. We done extremely well in the last couple of years. And now it shows that some of that performance was just simply the extreme financial situation around COVID that we personally didn't really want to be exposed to in the first place. So we made money with something we didn't want to be exposed to. And that's the third lesson. When you have these extreme events around your particular portfolio, in other words, when things happen that are not related to your particular stock. So valuations go up a lot. You should be very, very careful, and you can hedge a put position. It's not a bad thing to hedge a position. It's not like, what's the word? It's not unprofessional. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you don't know what you're doing. It's okay to hedge, and we didn't. And now this brings us to the big question, what are we doing now? Because right now we're still unhedged. We do manage our leverage, but that's about it. So we don't really manage our position in terms of hedging and shorting. And here's why we're not doing that, because we see a lot of good signals. We see a lot of positive signals. We see signals of bottoming out. Growth and innovation is bottoming out relative to non-growth and non-innovation stocks. So we see a lot of good signals. We see a lot of signals that the elites, the Supreme Court, and also in Congress, we're seeing a shift. Even though the Republicans didn't win the whole of Congress, they were able to get the House, which will put a brake on government waste and spending. We see people going back to work en masse. So there's a lot of positive signs that we think are reasons enough to hold on to our positions. Now let's talk about the topic of this episode, which is rational choice. Now, rational choice is, if you're rooted in microeconomics, it starts with mathematically precise, parsimonious dynamics that describe behavior of agents, human agents, digital agents. It could be any kind of agent. And the powerful thing about rational choice is that it's simple and it allows for predictions that can be refuted. So this is the powerful thing about it. So if you and we are very strong Popperians here at Orange Capital Partners. So for regular listeners, you know where this is going. We're very happy with rational choice, not because it's some sort of ideological, fundamental view of the world that we abide to. It's not that. It's that it's a tool, it's a mechanic that allows for iteration in knowledge creation. And here's what I mean with that. So if we take rational choice and we define, let's say, the behavior of humans in a particular situation, we can experiment, we can see how that pans out, we can build models, we can actually program it, which is very powerful. As opposed to rational choice, if we take something like moral relativism, which is unfortunately very prevalent in academia right now, and again, this is not a political view on things at all. The problem with moral relativism is if we say something like, well, everything is driven by power, and it's okay for, let's say, gender studies to become more powerful at the university because it's just, instead of being less powerful, they're more powerful, and it's all about who has more power, and the old hierarchy, and it can be replaced. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't replace it. All those kinds of things, they have political meaning and they have political content, but they're not really scientifically workable. So there's not a lot you can do with that in terms of knowledge creation. So it turns into some Marxist versus non-Marxist struggle, and that's not very productive, at least on the scientific side. I don't want to have political discussion here, so please bear with me for those people who have strong political opinions one way or the other when it comes to rational choice and moral relativism. Please, this is not the forum for that. I just choose not to talk about it here. I'm happy to talk about it somewhere else if I get invited, so that's not the problem. So again, we are big proponents of rational choice theory as a tool in science. And by the way, we also, as opposed to, let's say, moral relativism, as opposed to religion as a fundamental theory of choice, again, we just don't think that those other alternatives are very useful for the scientific process. This is the key of our argument. And again, what is rational choice? Let's just keep it simple. It's a mathematically definable course of action that agents take, and it's also a recursive course of action. So it's kind of like the Bellman equations in control theory, in engineering, that are now being used, for example, in reinforcement learning. And that's what's so interesting about this whole concept of rational choice. If you take, let's say, the Bellman equations, for those who don't know, please Google it. I don't want to spend time here. I wouldn't probably even be able to explain it very properly. But here's what the Bellman equations do in a nutshell. They explain behavior today, which is based on today and future choices. And the choices could be, let's say, driven by reward. They don't have to, but they could be. And the key is that today's decision is based on what you think you're going to have as a reward in the next iteration of your decision-making process, but also it depends on all the other future iterations. Therefore, it's recursive. And I think we can use that as an extrapolation to any kind of decision-making which is rooted in rational choice. What's great about it, again, it's something that we can actually program. And even though Bellman himself said the curse of dimensionality, so once we get too complex in a system, we can't actually do the computation, but at least we can conceptually program what these choice mechanisms are. So this is, I would say, number one, that's why rational choice theory is so important. Now, modern academics have stepped away from it. Now, my conjecture is that they haven't stepped away from it for the right reasons. In other words, they often cite things like Kahneman, Tversky, so the behavioral side of things where, let's say, over the last 20 years, economics and any kind of social choice theory has been infiltrated with psychological biases and those sort of things that basically tell us, listen, humans are not rational. I think that's a very weak argument.
Because it doesn't help. I mean, it's not really explaining how to proceed. It's just saying, look, you got to be careful. You got to be careful. Mistakes can happen. I don't see that as a reason to refute rational choice theory.
Using them as a reason not to build on rational choice theory is wrong, because this is a little bit like the efficient market hypothesis. Even though markets are not efficient in a strong sense, you can use it as a baseline and then work with the anomalies to try to get better theories. So in that sense, the same way I'm not throwing the rational choice theory out of the window, I'm also not throwing the efficient market hypothesis out of the window. Doesn't mean I strongly believe in it and that's the only thing I believe in, but it's a very good tool. And I personally believe that Kahneman and Tversky have been a bit of a hoax, because their books are very interesting, but they're not very useful, because they're kind of like saying, well, you got to be careful because there's other things to consider. Yeah, but what are they? And then once we take things like the confirmation bias into account, what are we really doing here? We're just saying, well, people make mistakes. If we go back to rational choice, people just make mistakes for some reason or other. It's not very clear to me what exactly is the contribution other than saying, well, things can turn out differently for reasons X, Y, Z. Again, I'm not, I don't want to trash Kahneman, Tversky, but I think they're overrated. That's my point here. And therefore, I think using them as a reason to defute rational choice theory is wrong. It's good to incorporate them into, let's say, something like Bellman equations. You can have dummies or biases and all that kind of stuff, which actually in reinforcement learning is very prevalent, as RL researchers know. So there's nothing wrong with using biases. There's nothing wrong with, even in financial markets, let's say, using an efficient market hypothesis, but then put in, let's say, a bias in the behavior of stock markets, which is, let's say, the bias is because we have inflation and because we live in a fiat monetary system, that everything always keeps growing at a certain rate because there is inflation. So there's nothing wrong with these kinds of things. But again, I think refuting rational choice theory is wrong. And I think the reason a lot of academics refute rational choice theory is because of the political pressure they have in academics. And again, that's a conversation for another podcast. But I feel like here, this is a shout out to all the academics who have the spine to stand up and go into a classroom and be even yelled at, because I think it's incredibly important for science to stick with science and not to yield to the political pressures that come with it. By the way, science is not a conclusion. Science is a form of inquiry. And this is the key. So if I choose rational choice theory as a basis for my work to think about how people make decisions, then that is a choice that I make for my inquiry about how things work. And it's not a conclusion, for example, that, well, this is the only thing we should look at or anything like that. So now let me get to the third point of my presentation, which is really the key here, which is how do we see it at Orange Capital Partners? A rational choice theory, Atlas Shrugged, which is a book I haven't read, by the way, yet, but I will soon, but I kind of get the sense for what it's about. Ayn Rand, all of these things, they're fine. They're absolutely okay. They were written in the 1930s, I believe. So there has been about 100 years of development, and we should take that very seriously. And one of the biggest developments ever since is Popper, okay? Popperian approach to the world is simply, look, like I said, it's a form of inquiry. We don't make conclusions based on our tools. We use our tools in, let's say, rational choice theory, and then we make conjectures and we refute them and we go on. So the question then from our perspective, let's say if we look at something like Twitter or Elon Musk and so on and so forth, and we think, okay, how is this going to evolve? I think the key question is not what do we predict will happen in the future. The question is what kind of choices should we make as investors based on the choices that our portfolio companies make? What's the best way to make choices about how to iterate? To us, this is the much, much more important question. So let's say, for example, if a company iterates around interesting problems, then that is a good sign. And we've introduced the concept of the natural Sharpe ratio, which has that variable as the key driver of returns. It's iteration, but iteration around interesting problems. Interesting problems are problems that, number one, are clear and where solutions can be found, because, again, like climate is not an interesting problem, but decarbonization is an interesting problem. If you want to know more, please go back to what we've talked and written a lot about this. So find interesting problems and then iterate around them. So rational choice is very tightly related to finding interesting problems, companies that iterate around interesting problems. Tesla is one of those companies. And unfortunately, what Musk is doing now with Twitter is a hybrid, because it's an interesting problem. Twitter is an interesting problem. For example, free speech is, like we said, is not a good problem to solve. However, the speech which is not controlled by authority is an interesting problem to solve. And Twitter is, in our view, trying to solve that problem with Musk. So he's attacking a very interesting problem. Unfortunately, he's doing it in a context that doesn't really help us as shareholders right now of Tesla. So our conclusion here is that that Musk, as interesting and intelligent and as well of a CEO as he is, as good as a CEO as he is in terms of finding interesting problems and iterating around them, he's making a fundamental mistake. And the mistake is that he's now iterating around a problem which is not incredibly interesting for Tesla. So as shareholders, what do? We said we stick around because we think that the macro is improving and that the risks that are here, certainly we have to put the contagion of FTX, for example, is a very big problem. However, we believe that the problems that Tesla is solving are still so much more interesting than any alternative, that our cost of capital is still Tesla, and therefore we stick around with Tesla. So very similar to the Bitcoin maximizers, where they say, look, the best is you hold Bitcoin because that is the best return you can get for your wealth. The same way we think about Tesla as the best return that we can get for our wealth. The only difference between Bitcoin and Tesla is that, of course, with Tesla there is a throat to choke, which is Musk. He can be hurt by people, or he can just hurt himself, which is a risk to the company that we think is probably not as high as people might think. In other words, it's a bit like Apple. When Steve Jobs unfortunately passed away, Apple wasn't finished as a company, and we see Tesla very similar. So to summarize, the question of rational choice from our point of view is the right question to ask, because, the question is, should or should we not follow rational choice? And we believe that the question is a good question, and the answer is yes. And the reason is because it allows for programmability, and it's a parsimonious way to look at decision making. So it's taking complexity out of a system and then rebuilding the complexity based on first principles. And this is a very, very strong concept. We believe that refuting rational choice based on Kahneman Tversky is wrong, because number one, Kahneman Tversky from our point of view, doesn't really have a lot to add. And second, it's being used for political, meaning refuting rational choice theory. In our view, is much more politically driven than scientific. And third, what we're trying to say here is that the right questions are not how is rational choice actually, is rational choice the right thing or not? The question is, what is the choice you make in terms of how you iterate? So the Popperian view of the world, in our view, overwhelms the questions of rational choice versus other kinds of choice. It's the question of how do you iterate? And you iterate around interesting problems. This is the key. Interesting problems where there is a potential solution set and where you can create new and better problems by solving those problems. This is where we stand on capital. This is the kind of capital that we like to be exposed to, or this kind of wealth creation that we'd like to expose our capital to. Thank you.